No, and thank you for bearing with me and bringing together in today's discussions both lectures for this week. And what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be crossing into kind of a new realm in this course that we have to date. We've reviewed the proposition that President Kennedy was killed solely by Lee Harvey Oswald, and the discussions that we've had about what the implications of that are, the difficulty that the American public has in accepting that for the various reasons. Some of them psychological, some of them evidentiary. And we've also reviewed the first principle alternative theory of the case, which is the decision on the part of the House Select Committee on Assassination that came to the determination that the President, contrary to the findings of the Warren Commission and the FBI and the Dallas Police Department, they came to the conclusion it was more probable than not that the President had been killed as a result of a conspiracy. And they had, in the actual official report of the House Select Committee, they had indicated that the most probable suspects involved in this were, quote, a certain element of Miami-based anti-Castro Cubans from the exile community and a certain element of organized crime. But in that report, they did not designate exactly who they were talking about in that case. But as we pointed out, G. Robert Blakey, the chief counsel for the Select Committee, and the chief staff writer, Dick Billings, followed up by writing a book called The Plot Against the President, Plot to Kill the President, in which G. Robert Blakey went on in some detail, pointing out that he believed that it was basically an organized crime hit, a retaliation against the Kennedys for having mounted this major aggressive campaign against organized crime, and that they simply used the Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban community to do the killing. And we've begun now to cross over into an important area in which a substantial number of the people who have investigated this particular crime had come to the conclusion that in fact the Central Intelligence Agency itself had killed the president. So what we want to do is we want to review that today, and I want to take you with me again on the journey that has led me into being the one that's here talking to you about all of this, why it is that I have spent the time looking into this that I have, and why I've been asked to do this course, whereas no one else at the academic level has been asked to teach a course about the Kennedy assassination at the college level, because they were basically just researchers who had come to the investigation through some sort of ideological commitment. And because I had actually been involved directly in investigating this in a strictly legal context, I've been asked to do this. I'll go back with you again to the time that I first began to encounter this. I, like everybody else, as I mentioned, when the actual event occurred on November 22nd, 1963, I just saw what everybody saw on the television. That massive, intense reporting all weekend long, first of the assassination, then of the preparation for the funeral, and then the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald by Ruby on national television, then the full panoply of the funeral and the mourning that went on. And I didn't have any specific extra personal involvement other than that of the regular citizens, other than for the special role that we had as the generation that was just 18 years old, had just come out of high school when President Kennedy was killed. It was that very fall of our very first semester in college. And so we had come out, we were the kind of the tip of the spear of the entire generation, the largest generation in the history of the world, the baby boom generation, coming out into the world with a very idealistic set of beliefs about the values of our country, of the aspirations of our country, of the special role that our country played in the world, promising democracy and liberty, individual liberty and constitutional rights for everyone in the world. To have encountered this type of an event right at the beginning of our educational experience at the college level had uniquely traumatized the baby boom generation. And I was in the very kind of senior class of the baby boom generation, having been born right in 1945. And so because of that, our generation had kind of a special attention that was being paid to this event, because it began to raise questions for us about the basic credibility and reliability of our American government, because we began to share in the general and growing belief on the part of the American public that we were being lied to by the Warren Commission. And that even when it got to the point where the major investigations of the CIA, covert operations, assassination activities, etc., began to reveal to the American public the deeper truth to our foreign policy, our entire generation then began to be challenged by the events of the Vietnam War, only to learn that the Vietnam War was caused by lying and aggressive warfare policies on the part of our government. But at that point, we still were faced with the conclusion of the Select Committee on Assassinations that it was ultimately the mob that did it. And so that while it wasn't, it's just simply Lee Harvey Oswald, as the FBI and the Warren Commission have reported, that it was in fact a larger conspiracy that was organized by organized crime. We still hadn't come to the conclusion, and many people were not writing about it yet, that the CIA itself may have become involved. That began to occur because of the revelations that went on during the Church Committee of the widespread assassination programs that the CIA was engaged in, the type of lying that the government had been engaged in, the official policies that the Central Intelligence Agency had of actually lying to the American public. It became a feature of the CIA for them to lie and to distort and deceive the American people. And then when it was discovered that a minimum of some 42 full-time CIA covert operations people were actually had infiltrated the major news media in the country and were actively engaged in distorting the news to skew the news in the direction of the interests of the CIA, suspicions began to build. But I was in a situation where prior to all of that starting to happen, this is all the way back into 1973, and remember the investigations of the Watergate Committee and the Church Committee, the Select Committee on the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse, and the Select Committee on Assassinations all took place later in 75, 76, 78, 79. What happened is, and I've touched upon it in the past, but I want to review it here at the beginning of our discussion today, about what happened when I was asked to look into this. That I was, as I've mentioned to you, I was recruited by F. Lee Bailey's office, at the time probably the most well-known criminal defense attorney in the United States in Boston. That I had been at the Cahill firm after graduating from law school, was at the Cahill Gordon firm where we did the Pentagon Papers case, where I became deeply involved in seeing all 47 volumes of the Pentagon Papers and coming to understand the types of duplicity and lying that underlay that war. And then I discovered in those papers that there was a massive assassination program that was actually engineered by the CIA station chief in Saigon, Theodore Shackley, called the Phoenix Project. And that they were responsible for the assassination of at least 20,000 non-combatant civilians. And because I knew that, I started to become quite willing to look into whether or not there was something more to the assassination of the president, and beginning rumors about the CIA. But I was contacted by Bailey actually in September of 1972, shortly after the Watergate burglary had occurred. So you remember now, on June 17th of 1972, sort of just after the Republican convention had given the nomination for the Republican presidency for a second term to Richard Nixon, the Watergate burglary occurred on the night of the 17th. These 5 men, four men were actually caught inside the Watergate Hotel. There were four of them there. There was James McCord, Virginio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Bernard Barker. They were caught inside, and also G. Gordon Liddy. These guys were caught inside the Watergate Hotel by the Washington, D.C. Police Department. Came in and arrested them, and it became immediately known that there was some kind of curious background that all of these people had. But for some peculiar reason, there wasn't a lot made out of that. When they were brought in for their arraignment, James McCord, when asked what his employment was, he said that he was an employee of the Central Intelligence Agency. And the others turned out to state that they, in fact, had been CIA operatives as well. And then it began to unfold that there were 2 additional people who had not been caught and not arrested, over and above G. Gordon Liddy and Gonzalez and Martinez and Barker. And these were Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorini, a.k.a. Frank Sturgis, and E. Howard Hunt. And the peculiar reality now was that every single one of these people had a CIA background. But nothing was really done about it prior to the election. And so that between that date of June 17th of 1972 and November 4th of 1972, the media didn't really pay much attention to this. But when Richard Nixon was reelected in November, the additional information started to come out about these guys.
I think it's fair to point out, for total accuracy, Danny, that the Watergate burglars et al. Were actually they were not recruited out of college to come into the CIA and vetted as CIA agents or officers assigned embassy or analysts, full-time employed. They were specified, they were acquired under a contract basis for a specific project.
Except that E. Howard Hunt was a full-scale Central Intelligence Agency employee and operative. And so the bottom line is that what happened is that after the election, there began to be more attention paid to this, specifically by the Washington Post. That 2 young reporters from the Washington Post began to look into this. Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein began looking at this. And they began to start doing reports about a growing type of conspiracy that might have been involved in this. And what they specifically started pointing to was the fact that there seemed to be involvement on the part of the White House the administration of Richard Nixon in authorizing this burglary and potentially participating with the burglars. Now, that didn't seem like a great stretch at that time in light of the fact they found out that E. Howard Hunt was actually an employee of the White House and was in charge of the security for the campaign. And so that what happened is the story began to develop that not stressing the CIA connections of all of these people, but stressing the fact that they were working for Richard Nixon, who was the president in his first term, that they had been working. They were nicknamed the Plumbers Unit because they were allegedly hired by the White House to plug leaks. They have become very distressed about Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg, who we worked with in the Pentagon Papers case in 1970, that he had leaked this information to Neil Sheehan of the New York Times. We had all become involved in the office where I was prior to that time in getting the Pentagon Papers published and revealed to the world. And the Nixon administration was furious about this, and so they began a whole series of actions to plug these leaks. And they hired this crew under E. Howard Hunt to plug the leaks. And so that the pitch that was taken by the Washington Post in doing their investigation of the Watergate burglary was, oh, look at the potential criminal conduct that these people that were the burglars had engaged in before. And they broke these big stories like, oh, they burglarized the office of the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg in their quest to plug leaks. That they had been sent into other places, like certain institutes in Washington, D.C., to burglarize their offices. And so that the focus of the Washington Post reports began with the history of the kind of venal criminality of this particular group working with Richard Nixon. And then it evolved to saying, oh, worse than that, these people were paid by money that was raised by the committee to re-elect the president, that they were actually employed by the campaign. And so therefore, this was being characterized as kind of a political dirty trick. They were trying to cast it as, well, you know how it is in politics. You know, all is fair in love in politics. And in this particular case, the fact that they burglarized the Democratic National Committee headquarters, must have been basically to try to get at political data about what the Democratic Party was planning to do in the campaign against Richard Nixon. And isn't that awful? Aren't these venal little creeps, to coin a phrase, since they worked for the committee to re-elect the president, which was known as CREEP. So the whole tenor and tone of the reporting by the Washington Post was focusing first on this kind of venal nature of the criminal burglaries they were engaged in, and then the kind of political corruption of a political campaign that was willing to engage in dirty tricks against their political opponents. What wasn't revealed was the deeper dimension of this. So when these people were arrested, F. Lee Bailey had been contacted to serve as the attorney for James McCord, who was the wiretapping specialist that was another full-time recruited, vetted CIA operative, along with E. Howard Hunt, that he in fact tried to retain F. Lee Bailey. And F. Lee Bailey ended up contacting me at the Cahill firm and asking me if I would come and join the firm. And so I came and joined the firm, and he was trying to get out from under a federal criminal indictment. He'd been indicted in a case down in the Northern District of Florida with a client of his, and wanted me to get the charges dismissed against him so that he could in fact serve as the attorney for James McCord. Because as long as he was under criminal indictment in Florida, he was going to have his other partner, Jerry Alch, represent James McCord. So that was the context in which I came into the firm. We brought on the motions to get all the charges dismissed against Bailey, and as soon as I completed all that briefing and filing of those actions with the Court of Appeals, Bailey asked me to turn my attention to the Watergate case. And so I was brought on to work on the Watergate case along with Lee Bailey and with Jerry Alch. And my assignment was to monitor the investigation that was now going on by the House and Senate Select Committee on the Watergate burglary. It was chaired by Senator Sam Ervin from North Carolina. I was asked to monitor what it was that was going on during the course of those hearings. And so on the morning of May 23rd of 1973, this is now just a little less than a year following the burglary that was on June 17th of 1972. I was involved. I was listening to the first of these hearings on television down at the Gold Key Motel down in Florida, where the case was going forward against F. Lee Bailey, and Sam Ervin and Dan Inouye from Hawaii were questioning Jerry Alch, who was the partner of who actually was our law partner of the three trial lawyers in the office, and they were asking him about the public allegation that had been made by James McCord in a letter that he wrote to Judge C.I.A, who was the federal judge in the criminal case against the Watergate burglars there in Washington, D.C. James McCord had written the letter, and he was asserting that Jerry Alch, our law partner, had asked James McCord to remain silent about who it was in the Nixon administration that had ordered him to go in to burglarize the National Democratic headquarters. And the fact is that shortly after, he says, James McCord said that Jerry Alch communicated to him that he wanted James McCord to remain silent about who had ordered him to do this, and in exchange for his silence, that McCord was going to be offered presidential clemency from Richard Nixon. A rather bold move, you would figure, but it turns out that in fact Jack Caulfield, one of the staff members at the White House, in fact then contacted James McCord and offered him presidential clemency if he would remain silent. So McCord became convinced that Jerry Alch was involved in a conspiracy to attempt to conceal the involvement of the White House in the Watergate burglary. And so he made this accusation in a letter to Judge C.I.A. And so the Select Committee had brought Jerry Alch in front of the committee and had asked him about this. Jerry Alch denied having ever made such an offer to James McCord. And then Dan Inouye began to ask the question, saying, Mr. Alch, aren't you in fact the law partner of F. Lee Bailey? And he said, yes. Well, I'm sitting there in the Gold Key Motel. My investigator, Bill Taylor, is sitting at the bottom of this other bed. I'm sitting at the bottom of this bed watching this thing on live television before I was going to be flying to Washington to monitor the hearings in person. And Lee Bailey was in the room with us. And when Dan Inouye asked Jerry Alch, aren't you the partner of Attorney F. Lee Bailey? And Alch said, yes, I am. Dan Inouye said, well, isn't Mr. Bailey under federal indictment now down in the Northern District of Florida for mail fraud with his co-defendant? And Alch said, well, yes, but the fact is that case is getting ready to be dismissed against him very soon. And so then Dan Inouye said, well, then couldn't one get the impression, wouldn't it be reasonable for one to get the impression that Mr. Bailey might well be doing a favor for someone very high up in the Nixon administration in the White House in anticipation of getting lenient treatment with regard to his criminal case. And Jerry Alch returned by saying, well, actually, it's going to be dismissed against him very soon, so that's not really relevant. And so, but the minute that he said that, Lee Bailey turned and bolted out of the room and went out in the hallway at the hotel and started throwing quarters in a phone, in a public phone, and talking rather animatedly out in the hall. So I turned to Bill Taylor, my investigator, and I said, what the hell is this all about? And he said, I don't know. So I said, well, find out. And so what he did is he went to the chief investigator for F. Lee Bailey. At our shop, we had the three of us that were trial lawyers. We had about 4 other lawyers that were research lawyers for us, and we had another entire office of 40 Class A licensed private investigators that worked for us. And the chief of the office, the head of the office, was Bad Andy Tooney. Bad Andy was the former chief of detectives in the Boston Police Department. He'd gone on to the Massachusetts State Police and was the head of the Strangler Bureau that had caught the Boston Strangler, Tony DeSalvo. And Lee Bailey had been appointed by the court to defend DeSalvo, and so in that context he had met Bad Andy, who was the chief investigator for the state, and had hired him away from the state of Massachusetts and brought him in to be his chief investigator. And it turns out that Bad Andy, we called him Bad Andy because it was to distinguish him from Good Andy, who was the pilot for Lee's Learjet. So there was Bad Andy and Good Andy in the office. And it turns out that Bad Andy, when he had been the chief of detectives for the Boston Police Department, had hired Bill Taylor, who was my investigator, to work for him over in South Boston. And so they'd had a long history and background, so they were very close. So I turned to Bill and I said, look, go check with Bad Andy and find out what the hell's going on here. What is all this stuff about, Alch, approaching McCord with an offer of presidential clemency? Why is it we don't know anything about this? What's going on? So Bill went to talk to Bad Andy and brought him out, and they went away, far away from where we were there in Florida. They went away to another place where they could not be known, and they sat and had a long discussion about this. And what happened, and I've mentioned it to you, but I want to reiterate it at the beginning of our conversation about this thing. Now remember, this is May 24th of 1973. This is less than a year from the burglary itself. And prior to the establishment of any House Select or Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse, prior to the establishment of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, all of it. It's right at the very beginning of the Watergate hearings themselves. And what Bad Andy tells us is the following, that unbeknownst to us, Bill Taylor and myself at least, unbeknownst to us, he said, that F. Lee Bailey was retained by the Central Intelligence Agency. That he was on a thing called Index 4, which was a list of 4 private criminal defense attorneys who were on call, so that if in fact any CIA agent were caught engaged inside the United States in a covert operation, which is totally forbidden by the charter of the Central Intelligence Agency. One of the principal premises of the CIA is that they were not authorized to engage in any covert operations within the United States because of the fear of a political police force like this. That if they were authorized to engage in covert activities, spying, wiretapping, eavesdropping, blackmailing, in overthrowing other governments, they didn't want that going on at home. And so they had a specific provision prohibiting them from being engaged in such activities stateside. So we found it kind of peculiar to discover from Bad Andy that Lee Bailey had been retained to actually defend any CIA agent that was caught engaged in covert operations inside the United States. That was the first thing that we discovered. The second thing that we discovered from Bad Andy, he said that another thing that we didn't know is that F. Lee Bailey was also the attorney for Santos Trafficante, who was the major mob boss in Havana, Cuba, and in Florida. And that in that context, for some reason, F. Lee Bailey, when the Watergate burglary occurred, and he was contacted to represent James McCord, the CIA full-time employee, wiretapping specialist, that he, for some reason, reached out to Santos Trafficante to ask Trafficante what he knew about this. Primarily because the three Cubans that were arrested in the Watergate Hotel, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Bernard Barker, were all Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban exiles who had in fact been employed by the Central Intelligence Agency to engage in a covert operation against Cuba following January 1st of 1959, when Castro overthrew Batista, the fascist dictator down in Cuba. And everybody, all kinds of people fled from Cuba. The people that ran the gambling casinos, the houses of prostitution, the heroin trafficking, and others, and the other fascists that were in the military, they fled from Cuba and they came up to Florida, into Tampa and Miami. And Trafficante came with them as the Don of the Mafia in Cuba. So he came up there, and so that F. Lee Bailey reached out to him and asked him what the story was. Is that why is it that, because it turns out that these three Miami-based Cubans had all worked for Santos Trafficante. So Trafficante was approached by Bad Andy. Bad Andy was actually sent to meet with Trafficante to discuss this on behalf of F. Lee Bailey. And then at that point, Andy said to Bill Taylor, he said, look, you and Danny, you're both nice boys, and you just don't want to get involved in this. So I don't even want to tell you, what it is that we found out about what's going on. You two guys should just stay completely out of this. At which time Billy told him, he said, look, we've been asked by Bailey to participate in this defense, in this case, so we need to know what's going on. And Bad Andy said, no, look, you guys should both just leave. You should just leave. You should, just get out of Dodge, he said. Get out of Dodge. You don't have anything more to do with this thing. You don't want to know what's going on here. Which, as I've pointed out before, is not something you say to a professional investigator like Bill Taylor. And so Bill continued to press him to find out what it was that was going on. And finally, Bad Andy, actually through tears, began to tell him what it was that was going on. Because you could tell that he felt that it was basically a destruction of our innocence to actually be brought in on this type of a secret. And what he said is that Trafficante told him that when Richard Nixon, who had been the vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower from 1952 all the way to 1960, for that 2 4-year terms, for 8 years, during all of which Allen Dulles had been the CIA director since 1953, all the way on through 1960, that throughout that period of time, when Richard Nixon ran for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1960, at the expiration of those 2 terms for Eisenhower and Nixon, and him in the capacity of vice president, when he ran for the presidency in 1960 for the nomination, as soon as, he was very specific about this, it was very sophisticated, Trafficante, very intelligent guy, said that as soon as Richard Nixon realized that he was going to win the Republican nomination for the presidency in June of 1960, he said as soon as Nelson Rockefeller withdrew from the Michigan State Republican presidential primary race, that he knew that he was going to win the nomination. And so what Richard Nixon did is he got on the private scrambled telephone that he had in his capacity as the chairperson of the 5412 Committee of the National Security Council. The National Security Council had been created by the National Security Act of 1947, along with the Central Intelligence Agency. It had been created as a special group inside the White House, made up of the President and Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The National Security Council, and they didn't have at that time a National Security Director. They didn't have one. So but what they did is they had a National Security Council, and the Vice President would attend this meeting all the time of the National Security Council. And if the President was not available or not participating in the meeting, the Vice President would chair the meeting. And so there was a subcommittee designed for the National Security Council called the 5412 Committee. And that was predicated upon Section 5412 of the National Security Act, which created the Central Intelligence Agency. And what the provision said is that the duties of the Central Intelligence Agency shall be to gather foreign intelligence and to gather it together and to evaluate and analyze the foreign intelligence and make recommendations and file reports, basically, to the National Security Council about what the content and nature and implications are of this foreign intelligence data that they're gathering. That's their job. But in Section 5412, it also said, and shall, from time to time, perform other functions as designated by the National Security Council or the President. So there was this little catch-all phrase that was in Section 5412 of the National Security Act. So what the National Security Council had was a special subcommittee called the 5412 Committee, in which the Vice President chaired that, and they would discuss what immediately came to be known as covert operations. And you'll remember that shortly after the assassination, later on in 1963, the assassination of the president, Harry Truman, who had been the president in 1947 and signed the bill into law, had said that he was very, very concerned about the Central Intelligence Agency because as of November of 1963, that it had become operational, he said, and that it wasn't intended to be operational. It was intended to be analytical and to gathering information and analyzing it. Yes, Wes?
Was there anything in the in the 5412 that limited the CIA to being non-operational, or was it just completely left open?
Well, no. What it said, again, this is sort of from legislative interpretation. What it says is that their responsibility is to gather foreign intelligence information and to evaluate it and to prepare reports evaluating the international intelligence and provide it to the National Security Council and the President. That's sort of the nature of what their job is. And then what it says is, and from time to time to perform other activities that are requested by the President of the National Security Council. There's this kind of general, open-ended thing. Yeah, and so, well, more importantly, the question is very important that you're asking, because the fact of the matter that one of the major impetus for the creation of the National Security Council was, as I mentioned earlier, there was a Doolittle report that had been prepared at the request of the President at the end of World War II, when they disbanded the OSS, the Office of Special Services of the United States military, of the Army, that there was a desire on the part of people that had been involved in the OSS activities, the kind of military, special military activities of the OSS that were distinguished from the general military activities of the military. Invading beaches and bombing. So there was a special group, the OSS, that had a special kind of elite, sophisticated set of assignments that they would engage in. And they were a paramilitary group that were very special. And so even though they were disbanded at the end of World War II,
And that's where the paperclip operation came from too, with that group?
well, no, actually the paperclip actually came from the Counterintelligence Corps, the 101st Counterintelligence Corps, which was a straight up Army subdivision. But the bottom line is that there was a desire on the part of people who had seen the value of the activities of the OSS during World War II. There was a desire on their part to have some similar organization. Now this is over and above a simple intelligence gathering, an intelligence analyzing group. In the Doolittle report, which was the principal author of whom was William D. Pauling, said that they felt that it was necessary to have an organization in the United States government that was more capable, more vicious, more aggressive, more creative in its ability to identify and destroy its enemy than the enemy was, and that this could very well be perceived by the American people as being violative of the basic concepts of American fair play, but that in any event that it had to be done. And this was the recommendation that was made by the Doolittle Commission. And so that one of the major sources of impetus for the creation of the CIA, in all fairness, was not only to gather intelligence and analyze it and provide reports to the President and the National Security Council, but there was this other but the Doolittle report was completely classified. So there was this whole public reason for having the CIA, but there was this other behind-the-scenes knowledge that they wanted to have something like the OSS to continue that kind of activity. And so that the 5412 Committee was that. And what Trafficante told us is that Richard Nixon, throughout the 8 years of his vice presidency, which was for basically 8 years of the, by then, only 11-year history of the CIA. For 8 of those years, Richard Nixon had been the person chairing the 5412 Committee. And because of that, he had garnered to himself a great deal of special power in the covert operations field, because he was there chairing the committee that made these decisions as to what type of covert operations were going to be conducted, how they would be conducted, how many people would be involved in it, etc. And so what happened, Trafficante told us that Richard Nixon, in June of 1960, as soon as Nelson Rockefeller withdrew from the Republican primary campaign in Michigan, knew he was going to win the election. And so what Richard Nixon did is got on the special scrambled phone that he had in his capacity as the chair of the 5412 Committee, engaged in these covert operations, and he telephoned Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes is a very colorful person. It's one of those interesting things. It's like a whole generational difference, that those in our generation know who Howard Hughes was. He was a very kind of major figure. He was this kind of swashbuckler, daredevil pilot who became a multi-billionaire. And he had actually purchased a movie studio in Hollywood and was married to Betty Grable, and was a very, very famous guy. And he invented this thing called the Spruce Goose. It's this gigantic aircraft that was made out of balsa wood that was actually the prototype of the C.I.A. cargo plane. And nobody in the world believed that he could conceivably make this thing fly, and he actually did. And he was, yes?
When they call them in the movie, the aviators, when they call them to testify,
Yeah.
is that before or after they started confusing them?
That was before.
Before.
That was before. Because he actually had created a company called the Summa Corporation, in which he was involved in helping to design the C-5A cargo plane and other things. And what happened is, pardon?
The submarine.
That's right. That's the Glomar Explorer. It was a submarine retrieval vessel. So he actually put his creativity. This guy was clearly a genius guy, and he put his creativity to work working for the National Security Council. in developing certain types of technology in aircraft and vehicles and things for them through his Summa Corporation. And because of this, he had this clandestine relationship with the 5412 Committee, and therefore with Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon had actually taken kind of venal advantage. And I use the word venal literally with regard to Richard Nixon. You know, Richard Nixon was a venal guy. There are a lot of other characteristics that people have, but he was venal. And what he would do is he actually reached out through the covert operational relationship that he had with Howard Hughes to get Howard Hughes to give him like personal loans. And he got him to give him a personal loan, for example, for $250,000 for his brother Donald. And the various leaks about this had leaked out, and there had been trouble about this. But still, it was never revealed that Howard Hughes had this clandestine, covert operational relationship with Richard Nixon. But what happened, according to Trafficante, and this is the day after May 24th of 1973. So this would be on May 25th. This conversation takes place on May 25th of 1973 with Bad Andy Tooney telling William Johnstone Taylor, my investigator, about this. And he said that Trafficante, when he went to speak with him about this, about what was going on in the Watergate burglary, is Trafficante told Bad Andy that in June of 1960, when Richard Nixon knew he was going to be getting the nomination, he used the private scrambled telephone for the 5412 Committee to call Howard Hughes and he asked Howard Hughes to create a political assassination team. That Richard Nixon wanted Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, his brother, and Che Guevara, and 5 other leaders of the new revolutionary Cuban government that had come into power on January 1st of 1959. So that you're looking at it, they were only in existence for about 18 months by that time. And Richard Nixon told Howard Hughes in that telephone conversation that he wanted Hughes to set up a political assassination team to assassinate these Cuban leaders, but that Richard Nixon wanted this kept away from the White House. Didn't want any fingerprints on this from the White House. And so he wanted Howard Hughes to set this up completely independently. And according to Trafficante, Howard Hughes in that conversation neither agreed nor disagreed with the request. But after they hung up on the conversation, Howard Hughes contacted a young lawyer, a new young lawyer that was working for him by the name of Bob Mayhew. He contacted Bob Mayhew and met with him and told Mayhew that Richard Nixon was now going to be the new president and that the new president wanted to have this assassination team put together. And so Howard Hughes assigned his lawyer, Bob Mayhew, to do this for him. And so Bob Mayhew, now this is out in Las Vegas, Nevada, and Howard Hughes at that time had now started to become a bit of a recluse. And he was living upstairs in the penthouse suite at the Sands Hotel, one of the big casinos in Las Vegas. And because of that, his lawyer, Bob Mayhew, was there with him and knew Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli was the Las Vegas representative to the Sands Hotel and also to the Desert Inn that were owned by the Mafia. And Johnny Roselli was an agent of Sam Giancana, who was the Mafia boss in Chicago. And so Johnny Roselli was approached by Howard Hughes through Bob Mayhew. And Bob Mayhew met with Johnny Roselli and told him that the new president, Richard Nixon, wants to have, they all assumed that Richard Nixon was clearly going to win because he'd been the vice president for 8 years. He had all of this experience. He'd been a United States congressman. He'd been a United States senator. He's going to be the new president. And Nixon wants to have this assassination team put together, and you guys, referring to the mafia people, you guys have your own reasons for wanting to get rid of Castro and these other guys. They've overthrown the government of Batista. Batista was your business partner in your gambling casinos down in Havana. You know, he shut down all the houses of prostitution, and he's also shut down the heroin trafficking operation that you guys have going on through Cuba, coming out of the Golden Triangle. And so you guys have your own reasons for wanting to get him out of there. So would you guys be willing to do this? And they had a second set of meetings, over and above that meeting in Las Vegas. They had a second meeting at the Brown Derby out in Los Angeles, because Johnny Roselli also was involved out in Los Angeles in Hollywood, in the movie industry out there. He was a very flamboyant, charismatic guy who used to date all the kind of movie starlets out there, just as Howard Hughes did. And so they had another meeting, and in that meeting, Johnny Roselli agreed in principle that he would endorse this activity, but that he had to get it cleared through his principal, who was Sam Giancana. So Johnny Roselli flies back from California to Chicago, meets with Sam Giancana, and explains to him that Richard Nixon wants to have a political assassination team put together, but wants to keep it completely away from the White House, to assassinate Fidel Castro, and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and these 5 other Cuban leaders. And so Sam Giancana says, well, I'm open to that, but the fact is that this is in the jurisdiction of Santos Trafficante, because he's the mob boss down in Havana. And so if we're going to go knocking off the Cuban government, the government leaders, Santos is going to have to sign off on that. So they fly down to Miami in July of 1960, and they have a set of meetings at the Fontainebleau Hotel. And Sam Giancana is there, Johnny Roselli is there, Bob Mayhew is there, and Santos Trafficante is there. Now this is all being recounted to us by Santos Trafficante himself. So this is not hearsay to him. This is direct assertion of first-hand knowledge that he has about this.
I thought it was Bad Andy that was saying all that.
No. Bad Andy is saying this to us, but Santos is telling it right to Bad Andy. So with regard to Santos Trafficante, this is not just hearsay information that Santos has got. Santos has got first-hand, immediate knowledge of these meetings that are taking place. And so Santos tells him that they have two meetings at the Fontainebleau Hotel, and they come to a resolution that in principle they would be willing to do this, but Santos Trafficante says that he needs to be certain that this is coming from Nixon, and that it's not just Howard Hughes's idea, and much less not just Johnny Roselli's idea, that this has got to be from Nixon himself. So he wants somebody to come from Richard Nixon directly to meet with him personally, to give him the statement that this is from Nixon. So what happens, they have a third meeting in late July of 1960. And to that meeting comes a guy using the nom de guerre, Mr. Ed. And it turns out that it's Sheffield Edwards. And Trafficante named him specifically. And Sheffield Edwards was the chief of security for the United States Central Intelligence Agency that worked and operated under Richard Nixon out of the 5412 Committee to conduct covert operations. Very specifically, there had been a covert operation that was initiated by Richard Nixon in mid-1959 against the new Cuban revolutionary government. As soon as Richard Nixon went to meet with Fidel Castro and talk with him and tried to tell him that Richard Nixon, as the vice president of the Eisenhower Nixon administration, was willing to recognize the new Cuban government as long as the Cuban government refused to have any diplomatic relationships with the Soviet Union and or China, the two major communist regimes. And Nixon said that the United States would refuse to recognize the new government of Cuba if they had diplomatic relations with either one of those countries. And Fidel Castro rejected that condition on their sovereignty, said he had a right to have diplomatic relations with anybody and everybody, and that he intended to have diplomatic relations with all of the nations of the world. And Richard Nixon came back from the meetings, and he initiated a covert operation to undermine and to eventually overthrow the new Cuban government. This was codenamed Operation 40. That was the code name for it. It ran under the auspices of the 5412 Committee, and it was run by the Central Intelligence Agency under the supervision of Allen Dulles and Charles Cabell, who was the Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and a fellow by the name of Bill Harvey, who was one of the directors, and James Jesus Angleton, and a fellow by the name of Atlee Phillips, David Atlee Phillips. This was the group inside the Central Intelligence Agency that was responsible for the covert operations of Operation 40. And what they did is they reached out and they recruited as operational agents of the Central Intelligence Agency former opponents of the new Cuban government who had been close to Batista, the fascist, who was partners with the mafia in the gambling casinos and in the heroin traffic, etc. So what you see is that the Central Intelligence Agency under Richard Nixon had already begun to garble the identity of the Operation 40, of what it was. That many of the principal operatives of Operation 40, run by the CIA, were actual mafia gunmen. And so that you got this operation going, this covert operation going. It had been going since mid-1959. So here we are in September now, or in July. We're into July now of 1960. And so after Sheffield Edwards comes to meet directly with Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana and gives them the green light, telling them that this is being authorized and being requested by Richard Nixon, by implication by the Central Intelligence Agency, since Sheffield Edwards is there in person as the chief of security for the CIA, and therefore they want them to go ahead and do this. What Santos Trafficante tells Bad Andy, what he says is that, look, I didn't fall off no melon wagon. He said, I knew that we could be hanging out on this, that the family, La Casa Nostra, could be hanging out on this if we were to get caught trying to assassinate Fidel Castro. So what I did is I decided in making up this political assassination group, I was going to recruit my old gunmen from Havana, these now Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban exiles, who worked for me as gunmen, but who are now working for the Central Intelligence Agency. So what he did is he doubled down on Nixon, who had been using the mafia people to be his operational people in Operation 40, so that he could deny CIA involvement and suggest that it was mafia people that were attacking the island. And so what Sam Giancana did is he doubled back on him and said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to recruit the people that you recruited from me to work for the CIA. I'm going to recruit them to be this assassination team.
You mean Santos
Trafficante? Santos Trafficante.
You said Sam.
Oh, I'm sorry. So Santos Trafficante recruits 15 guys to be on this assassination team, and he's got very importantly, he's got Rafael Chichi Quintero, Felix Rodriguez, Rolando Martinez, Raul Jorge and Rafael Villaverde, Felipe Vidal, Ricardo Chavez, Jose Pasita Correa, also known as Ramon Medina, Rene Corvo, Jorge Gonzalez, Joaquin Sanchez, Alvaro Cruz, and Frederico Sanz. And they recruit these 15 guys, and they put them under but there's additional, you notice there was only 12 guys there. I know you counted them. But it also included, very interestingly, Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, and Virgilio Gonzalez. The three guys that were caught inside the Watergate Hotel, burglarizing the hotel with James McCord.
That's what I was going to
Yeah.
ask.
So these are the same guys, and they're part of what gets codenamed the S-Force.
Just two questions. Were those old Havana gunmen, were they at the JM Wave station?
The JM Wave didn't exist yet.
Okay. And then
JM Wave didn't exist yet.
And then my second question was, if these people were working for the CIA, would the CIA understand, like, the mafia was trying to, like, turn it back on them and be like, no, don't do this? Like, 'cause
Well,
were-
they didn't know who the people were going to be to begin with, that Santos was going to pick. Because they said, look, you're the one doing this. You know, all they did is gave him the green light. And through Sheffield Edwards and said, look, we don't want to know anything more about this. You go ahead and set this thing up, okay? But we've given you the green light to do it. So what he does is doubles back on them and recruits guys up out of Operation 40 that are his former gunmen, whom he knows and trusts. And what he does is he spreads these guys out, these 15 guys, he spreads them out among 5 paramilitary bases that were created by the Central Intelligence Agency to conduct Operation 40 out of. And there was one on a thing called Swan Island, right off the coast of Florida, on the eastern coast. And there was a place called No Name Key, down in the Florida Keys. There was a third base in the Everglades, and there were 2 bases in Louisiana at Lake Pontchartrain. One of them on the southern end and one on the northern end of Lake Pontchartrain. And this particular base on the northern end of Lake Pontchartrain becomes very important, because that's the base that Lee Harvey Oswald was working with Guy Bannister and David Ferry and the other guys that had been fingered by Jim Garrison.
And
So
so the
that-
base, was that Sturgis's, or was it?
No, Sturgis was operating basically out of No Name Key. He was doing some flying in and out of Swan Island, but he was the head. Frank Sturgis was the head of the CIA liaison. He was a much more active CIA guy, and he was the CIA liaison to the Miami Cubans that were all working out of No Name Key. And E. Howard Hunt
That was the Everglades, right?
was the Everglades. He was the guy coordinating the Everglades operation.
Who was paying for like the ammo and
Who,
transportation?
question, how is this being paid for? Yes,
They were skimming off of the hotels in Vegas, and they were
That's right.
driving them to New Louisiana.
that's exactly right. What they were doing is it was being paid for by the mob organizing a skim off the Desert Inn and the Sands Hotel casinos in Las Vegas. What they were doing is they were skimming cash off the winnings there, because there was no reporting of it to the IRS or anything else. They were skimming cash off, putting the cash in these very expensive suitcases, and then putting those suitcases in the trunk of Cadillac automobiles and driving them from Las Vegas through New Orleans into Miami. And then they were depositing that money in the Miami National Bank that was owned by Meyer Lansky, who was he was the principal kind of finance manager for the Casa Nostra in the United States. And then what they would do is they would wire that money from the Miami National Bank. They would wire it to the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, that was owned by this guy, run by this guy named Gaillon. And then they would wire some of that money from the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland. They would wire that money down to the Banco Internacional down in Mexico City into an account owned and run by an attorney by the name of Manuel Ogario. And that was the bank account from which this operation was being funded. And what they would do is they had divided up these 15 guys among these 5 bases at No Name Key and Swan Island in the Everglades, and the 2 of them in Lake Pontchartrain. They divided them up, and then what they would do is they would send a private plane around to pick them up, and they would fly them to Fort Huachuca in Arizona, which was a huge U.S. Army communications base, a military intelligence base. And they would bring them to Fort Huachuca, and they would sign in as operational people from Operation 40. They would sign them in that capacity, and then they would disappear. And what they would do is they would fly them from Fort Huachuca down to Oaxaca, Mexico. And in Oaxaca, Mexico, there was a base, a training base, on the ranch, the private ranch owned by Clint Murchison Jr., who was this extremely wealthy Texas businessman and son of Clint Murchison Sr., who also owned the Santa Anita racetrack in California, where J. Edgar Hoover and his deputy, Clyde, what's his name? Clyde Tolson, that they would go there for various vacations and be given free right to bet on the horses there by Clint Murchison Sr. And so at this ranch in Oaxaca, Mexico, this private ranch, there was assembled a triangular fire team training base there. Wes?
Was Murchison related to Brown Brothers there at all?
It's interesting. No, not yet. Not yet. The financiers that we'll get to with Brown Brothers Harriman are kind of a different group. That Clint Murchison Sr. was a very, very wealthy oil man down there. You get some of these oil people. So we want to move it step by step so that people keep clear. But what you've seen already is there is this garbling of identities taking place here. That you're saying, well, Richard Nixon is asking to have the assassination team put together, but it's not going to be official. He's not doing it as the vice president. He's doing it sort of in his capacity as the chair of the 5412 committee, which is all covert to begin with. He's contacting a guy who's a complete private citizen, who is not an employee of the Central Intelligence Agency or the National Security Council. He's just a consultant, and then it's being done completely privately by private lawyers, private mafia guys, and they're taking the money completely from private sources off the skim in Las Vegas. So it's not federal money that's involved, but all of the people that are working as the operatives are actually employed by the Central Intelligence Agency as operational people from Operation 40. So that you can see that this is being done on purpose. This is being done on purpose by every one of them. It's been done on purpose by Richard Nixon to recruit these mafia guys so that if they get caught attacking Cuba, they can pretend that they're mafia people, whereas in fact they're trained and financed and paid by the CIA. And then when the mafia gets ready to put them together as an assassination team, he picks them from Operation 40 for the very purpose that if for any reason they get caught trying to assassinate Fidel Castro or any of these people, that instead of the load falling down on the La Cosa Nostra for doing this, the CIA won't take responsibility for it, but the CIA will do everything in its not inconsiderable power to keep them from being caught and to keep them from being publicly revealed as to what they've done. So it's wanting to get access to the CIA's duplicity and their ability to deceive and dissemble that Santos Trafficante is looking for to get cover for that operation and to protect themselves against being punished for this if they get caught. So Santos Trafficante has communicated all of this to us, that this is how they're financing the operation, this is where the base is that's being handled, these are the people that are being involved in it. He's giving us all of this information. But you need to understand that he is assuming that he's passing all of this information through Bad Andy to F. Lee Bailey, who is in fact retained by the Central Intelligence Agency himself. Okay? But who is doing this as an alleged private attorney, just defending a citizen who's been arrested, James McCord. So we find out all of this information on May 25th of 1973. And so what happens is both Bill Taylor and I decide that probably Andy was right about our not wanting to be involved in this, and that it was time for us to get out of Dodge. And so I leave and go back to Divinity School, which was the thing to do at that time, and studying social ethics. Bill Taylor leaves and goes down to Florida and becomes the founder of the Florida Association of Professional Private Investigators. And so that's what happens right there. So we're in possession of this information at that point in time, and we're trying to figure out what to do with this. And so what happens is fortunately the hearings, the Watergate hearings, they discover that Scott Armstrong, working for the House Judiciary Committee, discovers that there are tape recordings going in the Oval Office of Richard Nixon. And so he finds this out as an investigator for the House Judiciary Committee, and the Watergate Committee subpoenas the documents, subpoenas the tapes. And this big fight breaks out between the House and Senate Select Committee on Watergate, demanding copies of these tapes from Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon invokes presidential privilege of saying that, he gets very self-righteous about how, you can't compromise the integrity of the private conversations of the president with his highest advisors, or else you're going to interfere with, dare I say it, national security. And so the United States Supreme Court rules unanimously against him and mandates that he turn over the tapes. And so what Richard Nixon does is, you got to picture this. Richard Nixon is basically now cornered in this thing, and he realizes that the Watergate burglars are three guys that are from the assassination team that he had put together back then, and so that these interesting conversations start to take place. So let's flash back to June 17th of 1972. Yes, Wes.
Just curious, why was Eisenhower so removed from the 5412 committee if he has every right to be the chairman of it?
For the same reason that Eisenhower was so far removed from everything else, basically going on in the presidency at the time, that he was not a hands-on kind of guy. There was a lot of jokes going around about it at the time that he spent more time on the golf course than he spent in meetings like this. But the reality of it is that the presidents have always, the jokes about the vice presidency are basically a cover for the vice president really being able to function in a very powerful way as the chairman of the National Security Council. And so while the president is going around having to do lots of speeches, having to meet face-to-face with congressional representatives, cut ribbons, kiss babies, do all the things that they have to do as a figurehead of the government, the fact is the vice president has historically served as the functional chair of the National Security Council and, very importantly, the head of the 5412 Committee in charge of covert operations. This was sort of this practice got established right in basically the first full administration.
So now it's commonplace for that to be.
Well, each administration has the ability theoretically to change the way things go. But the reality is that the longer there's developed a tradition of a certain thing, it's harder and harder to undo it. Because a president attempting to move against that then gets rebelled against by the entire bureaucracy. So saying, we want things to go the way they've always gone. So the bottom line is that what we see here, as of when we go back to the actual burglary of June 17th of 1972, we start to ask ourselves, what is going through Richard Nixon's mind here? That Richard Nixon has put together a covert plumbers unit in his first term from between 1968 to 1972 to actually go and burglarize places to try to plug the leaks. He's wiretapping the telephones of various journalists around town. He's burglarizing the offices of various institutes and stuff. These think tanks. He's got his group. He's actually got his group considering going and beating up people. Going to beat up Dan Ellsberg for having given over these documents. if we can't prosecute you effectively, we'll beat you up. It's that kind of thing. And so the bottom line, all of this stuff is going on in the White House, and what happens is this peculiar thing happens, like in May of 1972, just as the primary campaigns are kind of coming to some kind of resolution as to who the nominees are going to be, is before Nixon is nominated now. And what happens is the Democratic National Committee all of a sudden selects a new director of the Democratic National Committee, and they choose Lawrence O'Brien. And Lawrence O'Brien has just in fact resigned from being the longtime Washington, D.C. lobbyist for Howard Hughes. And they're broken out inside the Hughes empire, this three-way battle going on, as Howard Hughes became more and more of a recluse and more drug addicted and more eccentric and weird. There was a three-way battle broke out inside the Hughes empire for control of the empire as he was slipping away. And the three parties were Bob Mayhew, who had become by this time Howard Hughes's émigrés, as they refer to them. That he was his dark hand in all these kind of covert activities that he'd been involved in. And you had Larry O'Brien as one of the other three focal points of this confrontation, who'd been the Washington lobbyist for Howard Hughes all this time. And the third group were the Mormons, a group of Mormons that had been basically carrying Howard Hughes around, getting drugs for him. And what happened is Larry O'Brien is the first of the three to have been beaten in the conflict. And so he in fact resigned, and he was almost immediately made the head of the Democratic National Committee. And so Richard Nixon, seeing this happen, becomes immediately terrified that somehow Larry O'Brien, in his capacity as the Washington lobbyist for Howard Hughes for all this period of time, may well have come to know that in fact it was Richard Nixon who had actually asked Howard Hughes to put together this assassination team to kill Fidel Castro, which was the group that killed President Kennedy. And so that starts to terrify him, because even though he was only up against he was only up against McGovern, and he thought he could beat McGovern pretty handily, if in any way this information came out that he was the initiator of the assassination team that killed the President of the United States, that he was going to be destroyed politically. And so he in fact had Jeb Magruder, gave the direct instructions to Jeb Magruder to have the Democratic National Committee office burglarized, and that he wanted the top level wiretapping specialist and electronic eavesdropping specialist put to this test. And so he had E. Howard Hunt, whom he knew was a CIA operations guy, who was running the burglary operation, to get this guy, James McCord, to do the wiretapping and the electronic surveillance operation. And he specifically asked for the three Cubans that were working with E. Howard Hughes to be the ones to go in to do the burglary, because he didn't want to have to tell anybody else what to be looking for. Because these guys knew what the secret was. These guys knew that, in fact, Howard Hughes had been the one that put together the assassination team, because they were on it. And they knew that the assassination team had killed the president because they were involved in it. And so that they were sent in to try to find out whether or not Larry O'Brien had any information about this. So when they got inside the Watergate Hotel to actually go back in to replace a couple bugs that had stopped functioning, and they taped the door, the door latch, and they went in, and the night watchman for the Watergate Hotel came by and found the tape on the door, and the great night watchman decided to take the tape off the door, takes the tape off the door and locks the door. And he goes back and completes his rounds, and he comes back 45 minutes later and checks it, and there's tape on the door again. So he realizes there's somebody actively inside the building, and so he calls the police. And the police, the Washington D.C. police call Carl Schlaffer. Carl Schlaffer is the head of the organized crime strike force for the city police, and he's on a stakeout right nearby with his team of guys, all dressed up like scruffy hippies. And so he rushes over to the Watergate Hotel. They go on in, and E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, who are overseeing the whole thing, watching through binoculars and on walkie-talkies to try to communicate with them, start telling them that they're a bunch of hippies that are coming into the building, and they need to be on the guard. So what they do is they hide out inside the office, and in comes Carl and his whole crew, and they search through the place and find them and arrest them. So they drag them in, and they bring them in, and they bring them into to the court and arrest them, and right away the rumors start moving around that they've been arrested. And so Richard Nixon is down in Florida. He's down at his place in Florida, right next door to his best friend, B.B. Rebozo, who is a mafia connected guy and the best friend of Richard Nixon. So they're down there, and you can just realize how things have gotten to be by now, when the best alibi that Richard Nixon can have for not being involved in burglarizing the office of the Democratic National Headquarters is that he was with his mafia friend. And so that's what happened. And so he is notified about the burglary, and he comes back to Washington, D.C., and so the burglary's on the night of the 17th. The word goes out on the morning of the 18th that this has happened. So he's there at his office. There's a meeting originally on the 21st of June that he has with John Dean. John Dean is going to be his White House lawyer. And so there's a meeting that takes place in the Oval Office that goes on for some 20 minutes, which become the source of the famous 18.5-minute gap in the White House tapes. When they ended up getting subpoenaed, there was this gap of completely erased time of the meeting that takes place with John Dean. And so in John Dean, and of course nobody ever asked Nixon. They never interrogated Nixon. They never brought him in front of anybody to question him. He didn't have to spend a minute having to answer any of these questions to any official body whatsoever. But John Dean did have to, and so he couldn't remember what happened, basically, in that time. But fortunately for us, as it turns out, that the lawyer that John Dean hired later on was the lawyer for the United States Justice Department that had been pursuing the Church of Scientology and trying to get them denied their status as a church. And so, without going into great detail, his office had become bugged and wiretapped. And when John Dean went in to sit down to talk with his lawyer, and the lawyer said to him what was going on during the 18.5 minutes, he told him. And it was all recorded. I just happened to have heard the tapes. And so what happened is the president was telling him, he said, look at John, you've got to keep them away from this. You got to get this thing shut off. You got to shut this investigation down. This involves a covert operation that happened a long time ago that the president was involved in. And now he's always referring to himself as the president. He refers to himself consistently in the third person. And he says that the president was involved in this, and it involves these people, these Bay of Pigs guys that were in the Watergate Hotel. But it's an extremely sensitive operation. But it's something different than the Bay of Pigs invasion itself, because everybody in the world knows about the Bay of Pigs invasion, and they know that I was involved in organizing it. But it's something else, and it's a deep and serious problem, and you've got to do everything in your power to keep this information from coming out. Okay, so he gives them these marching orders. And so what happens is 2 days later, on the 23rd of June of 1972, Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff for Richard Nixon, comes into Richard Nixon's office, and on the tapes it says, Mr. President, I think we've got a problem here. And Nixon says, what is it, Bob? He said, I just got a call from John Dean, and he said that he's just received a call from Pat Gray, the new head of the FBI. because he had become the head of the FBI because J. Edgar Hoover had just died 2 months earlier. And so Pat Gray is put in to be the director of the of the FBI, and Bob Haldeman says he called John Dean and said, look, he's got a problem. He's getting major pressure from the people inside the FBI to investigate this check that was found in the left inside jacket pocket of Bernard Barker, one of the Cubans that was arrested in the Watergate Hotel, and that this check has been cleared through a bank down in Mexico City. And they want to investigate this. And Pat Gray wants to know if that's going to cause any problem for the White House. And there's a big long pause on the tape. And it's important because it turns out somehow Santos Trafficante, this is extremely important. This is on June 23rd of 1972. When we're getting told on May 25th of 1973 by Santos Trafficante is telling us about this conversation. And he says that there was a conversation that the president had. The president gave the order. The president gave the order to Bob Haldeman to shut off this investigation because he was afraid that if it didn't get shut off, all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out. And that's what he told us was the instruction that had been given to Bob Haldeman.
Do you think having the check in his pocket was like another ploy to implicate the CIA if and when they were to get caught?
Well, I don't think so.
No way.
I don't think so. Because what happens now is Bob because they never got near it. It's really interesting. You're finding out something right now that basically nobody knows anything about. Okay? That what happened is when Bob Haldeman says to Nixon on June 23rd, that morning, to the president, says that Pat Gray is getting all this pressure from the guys in the FBI to go down and investigate this bank account where the check has been cleared through, down at the Banco Internacional. And he wants to know if that's going to cause any trouble for the White House. And Richard Nixon says, Bob, I want you to go get John Ehrlichman, and I want you and John to go over to the agency. And I want you to get a hold of Dick Helms and Vern Walters, who's the deputy director of the CIA. Now, one of the deputy directors. Said, and I want you to tell them that they've got to contact the FBI and tell the FBI to get the hell out of that investigation right now. And Bob Haldeman says, well, Mr. President, what am I supposed to say to them? What am I supposed to say to them to tell the CIA, to tell the FBI as to why they should get out of this? And he said, you tell Helms and Walters that if they don't get them out of this investigation right now, all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out. And Bob Haldeman, after a few seconds, says, well, are they gonna know what that means? And he said, oh yes, they will know what that means. So that's what he did. Bob Haldeman went and got John Ehrlichman. They went over to Langley. They sat down with Dick Helms and Vern Walters, and they told them that the president had said that they have to shut off this investigation because if they don't, all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could come out. So the question is, what did that mean? It's the exact question, in fact, that Senator Sam Ervin, the chair of the Watergate Committee, asked to Bob Haldeman. When they played that tape for them, and you hear the president saying, when Bob Haldeman says, well, will they know what that means? And the president says, yes, they'll know what that means. Sam Ervin asked Bob Haldeman, what did that mean? And he said, I believe that they were talking about the assassination of President Kennedy.
Oh, jeez. He said that?
They said that right in the hearing room, and there was this dead silence that went on for like about 20 seconds.
Holy.
And then they just turned and started going on to something completely different.
Oh, my
Okay?
gosh.
And so the question is how did that have to do with the Kennedy assassination? And the answer to that is this, is that it turns out that the check that was in the pocket of Bernard Barker was written on the Banco Internacional bank out of the account of Manuel Ligario. It was the exact same account that they used to put the skim money in from the casinos to finance the Triangular Fire Team training base, where the assassination team was trained. Okay? And so that if they had gone down to investigate that, then they would have found the history of that bank account, and they would have found that the money was going to Clint Murchison's ranch. And they would have tracked it down, they would have found the ranch, they would have found out what was going on there, they would have found out that there was an assassination team that was operational, and they would have started investigating it. And what another little secret of this is that you don't know yet, and that is that, well, when Pat Gray was saying that he was getting all this pressure from inside the FBI to go investigate that, where was that coming from? And the answer to that is, it was coming from Mark Felt. That Mark Felt is Deep Throat. He was Deep Throat in the entire investigation of Woodward and Bernstein. And he kept telling Bob Woodward, follow the money, find the money, follow the money. And the problem is that Bob Woodward stopped when he found out that the money had come from the committee to re-elect the president. As soon as he found out that the money had come from the committee to re-elect the president, he said, oh good, we've got a great story here. That, the Watergate burglars were paid with money from the committee to re-elect the president. This is political corruption. Gambling going on right here. So they said, look, here's political corruption. It's a great political corruption story. So we've got the president authorizing burglaries and break-ins, and we've got him now using money from the committee to re-elect the president to finance these guys, and nothing was said in public about the assassinations. Nothing yet.
I don't know whether the conversation happened or whether it's historically recorded or not, but Ben Bradley, who was
Yes.
at the post at the time that this Woodward and Bernstein's boss,
Right.
was involved with the CIA at the time.
Right. 8 years.
Has now come to light.
Yeah.
At that time, so he may very well have put the lid on it himself. I don't know the answer.
Well, there's a lot of side issues that can begin flowing around here, so.
Why did they have a check that was like S4 stuff on him when that took place like 10 years ago? Was he still getting like paid like every year?
No, what they were doing is they had paid the Watergate burglars to.
Oh, it was the same account?
It was the same
Okay.
account. They were using the exact same account because they said, look, they want this to be black. They want this to be deep and dark, and they don't want anybody getting at it. So they actually put the money in the same account to pay these guys, because they were the same guys that they used to pay as part of the assassination team. And so it was Mark Felt, it was Deep Throat that was trying to get them to investigate this. And he kept saying, follow the money, follow that money. But Woodward and Bernstein only followed it as far as finding out that the money had originally come from the committee to re-elect the president. But they didn't pay any attention whatsoever to that bank account down in Banco Internacional. So therefore, they didn't follow it down there. They didn't get at the assassination base. But the reality is that the Watergate investigating committee realized that there was an assassination team going here. Okay, because what happened is they tried this. Now you got to remember now. This is 1973 that these hearings are going on. 10 years after the assassination of President Kennedy, and they realized that there had been a major effort that had been mounted in 1967, 68, which we'll get to, of trying to suggest that Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy had authorized an assassination team to try to kill Castro. There was a full-scale effort to try to lay the assassination of President Kennedy on Fidel Castro, and saying that this guy Lee Harvey Oswald was a leftist, communist Castroite, handing out literature, pro-Castro literature, and he killed him at the request of Fidel Castro, because Fidel Castro found out that Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy had organized an assassination team to kill Castro, and he retaliated against him and killed the president. Therefore, if they could get the people to believe that, then what they would do is have to mount up and go invade Cuba and knock out the new government, and these right-wing guys would be back in business. Okay, so what we've got here now is Santos Trafficante telling us on May 25th of 1973 that what he says is that this entire operation, he tells us, was decided upon just by the S-Force. That the S-Force killed the president. And that was all. That it was just the S-Force. These Cubans were furious because he said what happened is that in October of 1962, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and those big events of the night of October 26th of 1962, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff voting unanimously to attack the island of Cuba, even with a full possibility that would generate thermonuclear exchange and possibly result in thermonuclear war on the planet. And Kennedy had recoiled against that and backed up. What he had done is he immediately ordered them to step down from DEFCON 2, but he also reached out behind channels to reach out to Fidel Castro to normalize relations with him, reached out to Khrushchev, that we've covered before, to start a nuclear non-proliferation or nuclear disarmament treaty, looking toward the actual disassembly of all the nuclear weapons. And he had the speech at American University talking about the need to establish a new realm of peace with the Soviet Union, that he had gone completely 180 degrees away from supporting the Cold War. And so that we realized that in addition to doing that, he had very importantly, and this is Santos Trafficante talking now, again on May 25th of 1973, he said that Kennedy gave instructions that all 5 of the bases, the paramilitary bases, on Swan Island, in No Name Key, and in the Everglades, and at the Tuat Lake Pontchartrain, were to be shut down, that they had to shut these down. And Santos Trafficante was very specific with us, and he said that what happened is that after Kennedy gave the order to shut down those paramilitary operations, Frank Sturgis on No Name Key launched another military attack against the island of Cuba. And actually on December 5th of 1962, launched an attack against the island of Cuba and actually attacked a Russian ship sitting in the harbor in Havana. And Kennedy became furious about this, saying that he'd already given his word to Khrushchev that they were going to stop all operations against them. And the fact is, he was extremely vulnerable on this point because Kennedy had already promised after the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961 that he was going to stop paramilitary operations against Cuba. And he was lying at that time to Khrushchev. And so now he was in a particularly vulnerable situation. He'd given his word to try to avoid a thermonuclear holocaust, that he was not going to allow any more attacks on Cuba. And here goes Frank Sturgis, and he launches a military attack against the island. And so what Kennedy did, and this is Santos Trafficante telling us, what Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy in March of 1963. Now, this is following the orders at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62. In March of 1963, John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy sent in helicopter gunships, 6 helicopter gunships manned by United States Marshals and United States Treasury guys and Customs guys, and they went into No Name Key and they burned it out, and they arrested a bunch of the guys there, the Cuban Americans, and they charged them with violating the Neutrality Act of launching military attacks against a country with whom the United States is not at war. And so they arrested them and brought them in and charged them with a violation of the Neutrality Act. Yes?
How did they figure out where the bases were again?
They knew where the bases were because Operation 40 had created the bases. They knew where all of them were.
Okay.
They just didn't know about the assassination team, but they knew about Operation 40. And because actually Kennedy had revitalized it after the Bay of Pigs invasion, promising that they were going to stop the operations of Operation 40, and all they did is change the name of the code name into Operation Mongoose and continued. That's why Khrushchev had put the missiles in. Okay?
Not quite.
Yes, quite. Okay, go ahead.
Is that, was Operation 40 then in charge, was LBJ in charge of it? Or was it?
No, that Richard Nixon was in charge of Operation 40.
Yeah, but I mean after it went over to the Kennedy administration.
Then it was Operation Monsoon, or whether he was doing the stuff out of the 5412 committee.
Yeah, because
Yes.
LBJ was the
Yes,
vice president.
he would have been directly involved, absolutely.
And he would have been the chairman of that, or was Kennedy at that time executing his right to be chairman?
Well, Bobby had stepped in, and under J.M. Wave, Bobby had played a very aggressive role in conducting J.M. Wave operations against Castro. He was very much involved, but he had not, in fact, been notified about the assassination operation, which was going on outside the shop. It was shopped out to the mafia, and they were doing all this stuff with the other guys. So Bobby didn't know about that, but he did know about Operation Mongoose, and he was helping to run that.
When Bobby eventually found out about it, and the ZR rifle program,
Yeah.
that had been put together by William Harvey.
Yeah.
And Harvey was an agent who'd been involved with all this stuff for some time. He fired Harvey, he had Harvey fired and shipped off to the Rome CIA station.
Yeah.
But
So-
he was still in touch with people over here.
That's right.
In spite of that.
But they knew where the bases were. You know, so they all knew where the bases were. Okay, so we've gotten to the end of the first section here. I know this is going to be a lot, but this is basically as of May 25th of 1973, we're being told by Santos Trafficante directly that it was the S-Force themselves that did it, because they were furious about the fact that Kennedy's had sent in the helicopter gunships to burn out the base, first at No Name Key, and then a second one in April of 1963, when E. Howard Hunt and a group over in the Everglades started to mount up to get to launch another attack against the island, and they sent in the helicopter gunships again. So what Santos Trafficante is telling us is that these middle-level CIA employees that were really Operation 40 guys, that were Santos Trafficante Mafia guys, anti-Castro Cuban exiles, these are the ones that made the decision inside the S-Force to turn around and assassinate the president. And that it wasn't the CIA, and it wasn't Nixon, and it wasn't LBJ, and it wasn't any of these people. It was just these middle-level operatives who had become semi-autonomous, and they're the ones that killed the president. But Richard Nixon and the CIA and everybody else had to cover for them, just exactly like Santos Trafficante had intended they would have to do if they ever got caught doing this. And so that all of those things started to roll into place, and the CIA and the FBI and everybody else came in to cover up for this thing, because they knew if the word got out that these are the people that killed the president, it was going to be political disaster for all of them. Just exactly like Santos Trafficante had planned. Okay?
Do you think that because he said the S-Force acted as a standalone unit, does this indicate that he was still involved with the CIA or a government of some sort at that time when he told you all this?
Well, what he would have been doing is number one, he's covering the butt of the mafia, saying we didn't do it. He's covering the butt of the CIA, saying they didn't do it. He's covering the butt of Nixon, that he didn't do it. And he's covering the butt of everybody, except for these guys, who he's left hanging out, but he's not doing it in any way that is going to publicly reveal them. He's doing it completely privately. He's basically telling his own lawyers that these are the guys that did it. And so that he's willing to have a modified hangout position, as they refer to it, of letting these guys take the heat that were there. And that's what he was hoping to do, is to stave it off at that point.
But if he was still involved with the CIA or the government, he may have implicated them in what interest would he have in protecting them?
Well,
Involved with them?
because the Central Intelligence, because the La Cosa Nostra has a very vested interest in maintaining their relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency. They're the main instrumentalities of the smuggling of the heroin out of Southeast Asia, which is being used to finance the Kuomintang for the CIA. So there's a long-term relationship that they've got there that needs to be protected. He's an institutional guy, and so that what they're doing is they're going to basically toss over the side the guys on the S-Force that made this decision. Okay, so that's where we are at the end of this first discussion. What we're going to do now in the second discussion, after we get a break and you guys get some food and get something to drink, It's going to be, we're going to start moving on to the question now about whether or not the Central Intelligence Agency itself was involved in making the decision to kill the president. Okay? So that's where we're going to be going in a minute.
This is petty, but since everybody seemed to be pretty careful, why did these guys in the Democratic National Headquarters tape the door, especially if they could get it back open once it was shut, to tape it again? Why?
That's a lot of people have asked that same question. We'll talk about that.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
All right? So get a break, get something to eat, so we won't all be passing out by the time we get there. Okay, gang. So here we go. Now remember what we have so far now is we've got a theory of the crime where it was just a single individual deranged lone gunman, which was being asserted by the Dallas Police Department, the FBI, and the Warren Commission, and basically most all of the news media, who will, in fact, to this day, insist that their reporters only refer to the assassination as having been committed by Lee Harvey Oswald, period. Then we've got the House Select Committee on Assassination indicating that it was probably a conspiracy and that the probable suspects are a certain element of Miami-based anti-Castro Cuban exiles and certain elements of organized crime. And we've got basically a further articulation of that by G. Robert Blakey himself in his book, The Plot to Kill the President, in which he specifically lays it on the mob and says that the mob did it in retaliation against the Kennedys for mounting the major anti-organized crime campaign against them, in that they simply used the Miami Cuban exiles. Now we've got Trafficante's position in front of us as of the end of the last lecture. We've got Trafficante's position secretly conveyed to us on May 25th of 1973 that it was in fact just the S-Force, just the Miami-based anti-Castro Cubans that did this and trying to exonerate the mob. So now we come to our fourth theory of this, and that is all of this involvement by the Central Intelligence Agency in clearly creating the assassination team, clearly allowing the assassination team to function to try to kill Castro, clearly facilitating the anti-Castro Cuban community in conducting military operations against the island of Cuba. So we've got that much involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency. And so the question now arises is whether or not, first question that arises here is that, look, if Sheffield Edwards showed up at this July meeting, the third of the meetings down at the Fontainebleau Hotel there in July of 1960, where Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli and Robert Mayhew were all meeting and deciding in principle that they would put together an assassination team to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the 5 other guys. When Sheffield Edwards shows up and gives them the green light to do this, confirming that Richard Nixon wants this done, the question that arises there is, does that make it a Central Intelligence Agency operation, just in and of itself, the assassination plan? Okay? That if one were going to be presenting evidence in court of that, and that all that one had is the assertion of Santos Trafficante and Sam Giancana and Robert Mayhew and Johnny Roselli, that they sat in a meeting with Sheffield Edwards, and Edwards told them that Nixon wanted the assassination team put together, that, on a scale of 1 to 100, you're going to have a difficult time convincing most juries. that the testimony of two mafia godfathers and the lawyer for Howard Hughes, who's basically sitting up in the penthouse suite of the Sands Hotel with 6.5-inch fingernails doing drugs, is that somehow the CIA is guilty of trying to kill Castro. All right? But the reality is here, now I want us to keep clear, the shift over to this group killing the president is a separate step we'll get to. But the issue of the responsibility of the Central Intelligence Agency for the activities of the S-Force trying to kill Castro, that starts to become very evident here for a number of reasons. Number one, even though the funding of the assassination team is being conducted by the skim that's being taken by the mafia off the casinos, the Desert Inn and the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, even though that's mob money, and it's not CIA money or government money, the reality is, very importantly, and this is an additional piece that no one knows yet, and that is that the principal trainers of the S-Force down at the Triangular Fire Team base, down on the ranch of Clint Murchison in Oaxaca, Mexico, that there are two people there that become critical. One of them is a man by the name of Carl Jenkins. Carl Jenkins is a full-time Central Intelligence Agency paid employee with retirement benefits and dental, who is training these guys. Okay? And another fellow by the name of William Rip Robertson is there. And William Rip Robertson is a full-time paid vetted CIA employee training the S-Force down at Clint Murchison's ranch. So it becomes clear that whatever lengths to which the Central Intelligence Agency hierarchy wanted to go to conceal the direct hand of the Central Intelligence Agency involved in planning to assassinate and attempting to carry out the assassination of Fidel Castro, they were starting to jeopardize themselves seriously at this point when they put Rip Robertson in there and Carl Jenkins in there to train these guys. Okay? So that by that point, we're able to get a conviction against some individuals, at least, within the Central Intelligence Agency for a potential assassination of Fidel Castro. Now, there's additional evidence, however, that is available, and that is that there are memos inside the Central Intelligence Agency that Bill Harvey, who is a major Central Intelligence Agency full-time career officer, Bill Harvey is writing memos inside the Central Intelligence Agency about the assassination team and about the killing of Fidel Castro, so that we know that Bill Harvey is also going to be directly involved in any kind of criminal culpability of an assassination of Fidel Castro carried out by this particular S-Force. Now, obviously, we're also going to be able to find, eventually, if one were to obtain discovery, civil discovery in a case attempting to prove this, you would be able to find that the actual members of the S-Force, these 15 guys whose names I've given to you, that actually have been paid by Central Intelligence Agency operatives for their activities in Operation 40, which entails launching military and paramilitary strikes against the island of Cuba. Now, they could try to argue in response to that to say, oh, my money was being paid to me for blowing up bridges and poisoning sugar crops and burning fields down in Cuba, and I wasn't being paid for doing the assassination training. That was sort of extra, that I was doing that as my as a hobby while this was going on. But they would run back into the problem that they're being trained by Carl Jenkins and Rip Robertson and Rudy Enders and others down there in Oaxaca at the ranch. So those payments that are going to these guys in their capacity as Operation 40 operatives, and the records of them being signed in out at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, being signed in as regular U.S. government employees. Because just nobody just wanders off the street and goes into Fort Huachuca at that facility. So clearly, these people, the evidence is now building against these people that they are the Central Intelligence Agency is directly involved in promoting and fostering an assassination operation against Fidel Castro. And that whatever deniability they wanted to maintain about that is completely dependent upon their being able to keep secret these records that are in existence now. The paying of money to these people on the assassination team, the training of them by full-time CIA operatives, and memos going on inside the Central Intelligence Agency discussing the assassination operations. So we have now the important thing is we need to keep in mind that all of this having been authorized by Richard Nixon when he was still vice president and chair of the 5412 committee, but really it having been done in his capacity as the presidential nominee is another kind of technical legal question. When he reached out to Howard Hughes to ask him to put this assassination team together, he was doing so in his capacity as the prospective president, because he was overriding any authority that Eisenhower had at the time. That there's no indication that Eisenhower at that time had directly authorized this assassination operation against Castro. It was the brainchild of Nixon. But the fact is, there was a ZR rifle program that was inside the Central Intelligence Agency. Interestingly, where they had hired mafia hitmen to commit other assassinations. That they had, for example, participated in hiring people to kill Patrice Lumumba over in Africa in the past. So that the evidence is building against the Central Intelligence Agency as an institution, that they are involved as in a matter of official policy in engaging in this assassination operation. So, if they were to try to say that this operation that was set up to kill Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others was sort of sui generis, that it existed all by itself and there's no precedent for it, you're going to go find the information about the ZR rifle program and their involvement in killing Lumumba is going to be extremely incriminating for them. Okay? So what we have going here now, that all of that is in operation when suddenly Richard Nixon is not elected, except that he might actually have been elected. Because now we have to look at the fact that there's strong indications that Richard Nixon would have won the election back in 1960 if it hadn't been for particular criminal activity that was engaged in by the mafia with Sam Giancana and boss Daley out in the Cook County, out in Illinois.
So if Sam Giancana was involved with Kennedy winning the presidency, I just don't really understand why he would do that if it would potentially jeopardize the S-Force and Nixon being at the head.
Really, that's a really interesting point, and that's one of the puzzles that goes on here. That the fact of the matter is that John Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, had in fact been involved in organized crime activities back during the Prohibition. That he in fact was running booze during the Prohibition and was tangentially in business with Meyer Lansky. And there's evidence indicating that Joe Kennedy reached out to Sam Giancana, asking him to at least stand down out in Chicago and not utilize his goodwill with the various pollsters and poll keepers out there to not oppose his son for the presidency. And the arguments that are being made are that Sam Giancana perceived that reaching out on the part of Joseph Kennedy as a commitment on the part of the Kennedys that they would not engage in aggressive law enforcement against organized crime. That most organized crime guys don't really do things just to be nice guys, as a rule. And so therefore, if he's going to be providing some kind of assistance to them to win the election, he's expecting something in return.
But wouldn't he have gotten that same treatment with Nixon, considering Nixon would kind of be indebted to them anyway for the creation of the S-Force? So like, why would it really matter?
That's right. It's the real question is, what is the conceivable advantage that Sam Giancana could have possibly conceived of giving active support to Kennedy in beating someone that they already had basically in the bag with Richard Nixon.
Maybe he owed Joseph Kennedy for something in his past. Is that possible?
Well, the personal relationships are important, but we don't know yet. Maybe Greg does.
If you wanted to point out the key Fowler hearings and the rest of it, that Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy had already actively been going after organized crime, and this was potentially a way to make them stand down from continuing to do it. Because even if Nixon got elected, their influence in politics wouldn't have stopped, and they had already indicated that they were going after organized crime.
So what Greg is suggesting is that given the fact that John and Bobby had been, with John being a senator and Bobby having been employed as a legal counsel in the committees that were going after organized crime in the Congress, that maybe this would be a way to back them off, is to actually have their father get a favor done for them to help them get to be the president, and that then they would lay off on this thing. Obviously that didn't work because they came out storming after that.
I'm curious what your explanation is, after Greg's explanation is provided, what motivated Robert Kennedy to be so aggressive setting up the new Justice Department organized crime strike force, etc., recruiting some of the best and brightest aggressive new lawyers to join it? Why did he declare war on the American Mafia?
Well, Bobby is a true believer. Everybody that knows Bobby knows that Bobby's a true believer. He even when he was playing touch football with people, he used to kind of maul them. And it was very clear that Bobby and Jimmy Hoffa developed a very deep-set enmity toward each other. That they were very angry, and that's why many people believe that Jimmy Hoffa was involved in trying to kill the president and Bobby, both.
That explains going after Hoffa and corrupt unions, but it doesn't just explain declaring war on all the mafia families.
Well, what I'm saying is that if in fact one is put into a position of being the chief law enforcement officer for the federal government, and you know that there is major organized crime going on, and that the J. Edgar Hoover has for 30 years been denying it, that it really has a question. It has to do with one's own sense of personal integrity. Is that if you've accepted the assignment to do this, Bobby resisted, as you know, being made the Attorney General. But once he was made the Attorney General, it appears, I don't want to get too far down this road, but it appears that he basically took it very seriously. And because he'd already been involved earlier in confronting Hoffa and others, that once he got his hands on the power to do it, he basically just went right after them. So we want to just, it's an important question. But the bottom line is that I returned to our narrative here, and that is that when Kennedy was elected and Nixon wasn't elected, the question then became were the Kennedys going to be willing to continue the operations of Operation 40 against the new Cuban revolutionary government? They were never, in fact, confronted with the question of whether they were going to continue the operation to carry out the assassination of Fidel Castro. But the fact is, they were approached and asked to participate in continuing Operation 40, and that clearly Bobby and John were willing to do. And so that they continued Operation 40 from the time they got in on January 21st of 1961 all the way through to basically April 21st, so January, February, March, and April, for 4 full months, they were fully supportive of the activities of Operation 40, and it was running as Operation 40. And when they got in, they were confronted right away by a previous plan that had been put in place by Richard Nixon, that as soon as he were be inaugurated on January 21st of 1961 to be the new president, he was going to authorize a full-scale military invasion against Cuba. And that he was going to do this under the cover of having a number of the Operation 40 Cuban exiles from Miami be trained at a base in Guatemala and be supported by aircraft coming in out of Nicaragua. We're going to come in and land on the beach at the Bay of Pigs, and they're going to plant the flag of the free Cuba, and they were going to invoke the support and recognition of the United States government, of their new beachhead government. And the whole plan was already in place. And what happened is when Bobby and John and Bobby came into office, and they were confronted by this that they hadn't known about before. They went back and forth on it. And the way in which John modified this was saying, look, I'll agree that if what you're telling me is that the citizens of Cuba are going to rise up upon a landing party landing on the beach and declaring a free Cuba, that the people are so disgruntled with the new government in Cuba that they're going to rise up and overthrow the government on their own, then we'll go along with that part. So he basically took them at their own representations, saying that was going to happen. Now, the obvious fact is that the CIA knew that it wasn't going to happen. They had their own evaluation already done that wasn't going to happen. And so what they were doing is they were engaged in basically a covert operation against the president. They were intending that they were going to go land on the beach with all the pretense that they were going to be supported by an uprising of the people. And when it became clear that the people weren't rising up, they were then going to turn and go back to Kennedy and say, oh, it isn't working. You've got to send in the Marines. You've got to send in the United States Air Force to blow out the rest of the airplanes, the handful of airplanes that the Cuban government had, the jets, and send in the United States Marines. And that's exactly what they did. They attempted to pull off a covert operation against the President of the United States, of converting this landing beach thing into a full-scale military invasion, because they thought that Bobby and John together would be so committed that their macho would be on the line, to say nothing about the esteem of the United States, and that they would then transfer their previous resistance to the full-scale operation into supporting it. In fact, as we now know, there were, in fact, and this becomes important with regard to the Joint Chiefs, because it's now clear that there were full military mobilization undertaken on the part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to send military ships with United States Marines on board up to the island of Cuba to be prepared for their being able to basically turn Kennedy around and get him to agree in extremis that he would allow them to go in. So what you have here is you have not only a covert operation on the part of the Central Intelligence Agency functioning against the President of the United States, who has given them a direct order that there's going to be no U.S. military direct involvement, but you also have the Joint Chiefs of Staff directly involved in mobilizing military and naval forces to go and get in place to be prepared to actually go into Cuba if the President can be turned around on this.
That is called prudent contingency planning.
Please. Prudent contingency planning to defy the President of the United States. A direct order that they're mobilizing to try to basically push the President into having to do this. And so that's exactly what happened. And what happened is John refused to do it. Bobby refused to agree to this either. And what happened is they became so angry, not necessarily at how screwed up the plan was and how they got wrong bringing in their military air support from Nicaragua because they had a different time zone and they showed up an hour late. And the guys got themselves clobbered on the beach and got their boats sunk, with all the ammunition in it. It wasn't just the incompetence of the operation. It was, in fact, the fact that the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff together had been conspiring to basically defy the President of the United States. And if they'd gone ahead and put people into positions, military positions, to carry this out in complete defiance of a direct order of the President of the United States. So the degree of anger that the President had in the face of that kind of conduct on their part, and the degree of anger that they had over and against him, refusing to succumb to it, when they put him into that situation, that he was actually willing to compromise the good name of the United States and the integrity of the United States in defiance of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA. And he did do it. And so what happened is right at that point, in late April of 1961, you had a situation arise where the President of the United States had seen the covert operations of the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff operating together in defiance of the President of the United States. And he is quoted, reliably, as having said that he was going to splinter the Central Intelligence Agency to 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. And that but what he did is he set forth in 2 national security action memoranda, number 56 and number 57. He began to take paramilitary power away from the Central Intelligence Agency. That this power that they had accrued since 1948, after the passage in October of 1947 of the National Security Act of 1947, that they had accrued this power to conduct not only covert operations, but kind of almost full-scale military operations in working with the Joint Special Operations Command, the Air Force element of which was handled by L. Fletcher Prouty, who's talked with us about that. So that what Kennedy did in National Security Action Memoranda number 56 and 57, he actually entered an order that the Central Intelligence Agency was no longer going to be authorized to mount any type of significant military activities at all. And that all of those decisions had to be made by the military itself. Now, what this was doing is it was actually catering to some extent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were very distressed about not having been given responsibility to actually participate in the military planning of the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA kept control of that under their own auspices, and so therefore they were able to take advantage of arguments about incompetence, simple incompetence on the part of the CIA. So what you saw Kennedy doing, Kennedy was attempting to split the alliance that existed between the CIA and the Joint Chiefs in their Joint Special Operations Command by saying that the responsibility for the failure at the Bay of Pigs falls on the CIA, but not the military. And so therefore we're going to back up and take that paramilitary authority away from the CIA and transfer it to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, hoping that that's going to placate and satisfy the Joint Chiefs of Staff so he can begin to get some kind of a relationship and control over the Joint Chiefs. Okay? Now, but the problem is that you had guys like Lemitzer and Arleigh Burke at the Navy and Lemitzer of the Army, and you had, most especially, of course, is Curtis LeMay in the Air Force, who basically viewed Kennedy's refusal to commit air power in Marine Corps and others to the Bay of Pigs as having been an act of cowardice. And actually, Curtis LeMay felt compelled to characterize it as that. And he referred to Kennedy as a spineless coward in an interview with the fellow who wrote 7 Days in May, Fletcher Nebel. Fletcher Nebel was a newspaper reporter that had a personality interview with Curtis LeMay, the commanding general in the Joint Chiefs for the Air Force. And in that, Curtis LeMay referred to the president as a spineless coward and a spoiled little sniveling brat. And the president of the United States, he referred to him that way. And so Fletcher Nebel was upset about this. He was kind of taken aback by this. And he noticed that that Curtis LeMay and Lemonster and others in the military were actually holding special classes, teaching their people in the military service all kinds of John Birch Society, neo-fascist kind of beliefs. That they actually had full-scale programs going inside the military. And so Kennedy cut those back, actually fired Edwin Walker, General Edwin Walker, who was a full out fascist, and fired him because of that activity. So that there was a lot of tension going on there in that first year between President Kennedy and the Central Intelligence Agency, and between President Kennedy and the Joint Chiefs, even though President Kennedy and Bobby were trying to placate the Joint Chiefs and give them more power over paramilitary operations. It would cause one to assume that they would like that and they'd be happy about that. But they weren't that happy about that, as it turns out. And so what happened is that Kennedy, in addition to doing that, he turned around and actually, after the Bay of Pigs, he apologized to Khrushchev. He took full personal responsibility for the Bay of Pigs operation. He apologized to Khrushchev, and he gave Khrushchev his personal word of honor that he would refrain from any further paramilitary activity against the island of Cuba. And then he turned right around and simply changed the code name of Operation 40 to Operation Mongoose, and he set up the biggest paramilitary operation in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency down on the campus of the University of Miami at a great big huge airplane hangar they called JM Wave. And he brought on a guy from Berlin by the name of Theodore G. Shackley, and he brought in Ed Lansdale. Now, this is an interesting move that happened right here. So you're going to say to yourself, why did Theodore Shackley come in here, who had been based in Berlin ever since 1948, as the deputy to Reinhard Gehlen, the former Waffen SS commander of anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence for the Third Reich? Here's this guy, Theodore Shackley, a German national and a naturalized American. Why did he bring him in to run the station in Miami against Cuba? And why did he bring in Ed Lansdale? Okay? And so we're going to get to that later. There's a deep and dark secret that is going on here at this particular point. I don't want to be unfair to you and just keep you hanging on that, but the bottom line is that peculiar things started to happen here, where these conflicts were going on, and Kennedy was trying to figure out how to navigate in this particular realm with these kind of powerful bureaucratic forces inside the Central Intelligence Agency, these powerful bureaucratic forces operating inside the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the alliance that they had formed over the past 13 years, working in covert operations together. The president was trying to get himself wangled into the middle of that to get control over that. And so he stepped forward and authorized Operation Mongoose against Cuba, the new Operation 40. And when he began to press on that and do all of that, and I don't have any big argument about this, but the bottom line is that Khrushchev was grossly offended at the fact that Kennedy lied to him, publicly gave him his personal word that he was going to cease and desist from these paramilitary operations. And when he realized that Kennedy had lied to him, he was continuing the operations against the island of Cuba. For that and perhaps other larger strategic reasons, he decided that he was going to put the nuclear missiles into Cuba and to protect Cuba, because he was convinced that the pressures that were being put on Kennedy was unable to resist them effectively, and that he had been bullied into having to recommence the paramilitary operations against Cuba. And so therefore he was going to ultimately end up having to succumb to the demand on the part of the military and the CIA to invade and overthrow Cuba. And so he starts putting in the Cuban missiles, the Russian missiles, into Cuba. And when Kennedy was notified about that, the entire Cuban Missile Crisis comes down. And the way that Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis totally infuriated the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because the Joint Chiefs of Staff were convinced to the man that the way to solve this was to launch a full-scale military invasion of Cuba and to knock out all of the missiles, to take a very strong and aggressive stand against the Soviets in this case. And Kennedy defied them, and he refused to do that. And he put a blockade, a naval blockade around the islands, and successfully negotiated a peaceful solution to that. But in doing so, he agreed to take the United States missiles out of Turkey. But very importantly, he'd already ordered the United States Air Force to remove the missiles from Turkey, and they had not done it. Okay, so that he was actually encountering that kind of pushback going on against him, not only on the part of the Central Intelligence Agency, but on the part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he had given a direct, major strategic order to the United States Air Force to remove the missiles from Turkey, and they had refused to do that. Okay, and so he found himself now in this situation where Khrushchev, in putting the missiles into Cuba, when Kennedy confronted him about being such a nasty SOB for putting missiles into Cuba, 90 miles away from us, Castro was therefore able to say, or excuse me, Khrushchev was able to say, yeah, well, you've got all the missiles in Turkey right on our border too. So it basically disempowered Kennedy from part of his negotiating capacity. So the bottom line is that when he ended up ultimately negotiating their way out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were furious at him, especially Curtis LeMay, that was in charge of the Air Force operations, that the missiles were still under the control of. And so that what you had there was a further exacerbation of this kind of confrontation and conflict going on between the president. And so what happened is the Central Intelligence Agency, that had clearly by this time become more and more directly involved in participating in the assassination training program of the S-Force to kill Fidel Castro, they kept on hoping that if that activity was successful, and they were able to kill Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others, that they could cut the head off, cut off the head of the snake and the body will die. That was their theory. So they kept that operation up. It is perfectly clear that the Central Intelligence Agency was engaged in an active program of attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro and the leaders of the Cuban government in complete defiance of President Kennedy, who ordered all paramilitary operations against the island of Cuba stopped, which clearly, even though they didn't know about the assassination program, would have included that. And when he gave that order, they defied it. And what happened is on June 5th of 1963, when Walter Sheridan came and told Bobby about the existence of this assassination operation going on, Bobby was furious. And John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy issued direct orders that the assassination operation was to be stood down, over and above the shutting down of all the paramilitary bases that they ordered after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what you got is, on the one hand, you got the anti-Castro Cubans, Frank Sturgis and the others on No Name Key, defying the president by trying to launch military strikes against the island of Cuba after they come right to the brink of a thermonuclear holocaust over this. These guys are still pushing for this. They launch other military attacks. The president sends in helicopter gunships against them and burn out their entire base and has them arrested. And they still won't stop. Then E. Howard Hunt and the people over at the base in the Everglades, they start mounting a paramilitary attack against Cuba. And so the president and Bobby Kennedy send the helicopter gunships against them and arrest them. So and the CIA is involved in both of those operations, because those are CIA. Hunt and Sturgis are both CIA guys that are basically coordinating those efforts to attack them. So what you've got is basically a full-scale civil war going on here on the part of the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joint Special Operations Command, working with these people, supplying military equipment, ships to them. And when the president on June 5th of 1963 orders the cessation of all attempts to assassinate Castro, what happens is there's an operation mounted by the Central Intelligence Agency under the command of William Rip Robertson, one of the commanders and one of the trainers of the S-Force, along with Rudy Enders and Grayson Lynch, and a guy named William Pauley, who is the principal author of the Doolittle Report that had basically advocated setting up a covert operations and the creation of a CIA. They end up mounting an operation to attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro again, arguing that, well, we can pretend that we hadn't gotten the order yet. You know, so they on June 8th, they launch an operation. They fly out of the Corrosion Corner down in Miami on a big PBY provided by the United States Navy from Guantanamo, and they fly off into the Caribbean and they land on the ocean out several miles off the coast of Cuba, and along comes this big private yacht owned by William D. Pauley called Flying Tiger II, and they come on and they take on the S-Force team that was flown in on the PBY. And with them is William Rick Robertson and Rudy Enders and other full-time Central Intelligence Agency operatives engaged in a flat-out defiance of a direct order of the president to cease and desist from trying to assassinate Castro. And they're pretending they've worked up a cover story that what they're going to do is go in and they're going to try to take into custody a couple of Russian high-level missile officers who want to defect to the United States and can therefore tell the United States that the Russians are not complying with really taking down the missiles like they promised to do. Which is total crap. It wasn't true at all. It was a total cover story for going in to try to assassinate because they had the S-Force on board. And so they had 6 guys from the S-Force that they put on board. They put them over the side in these little rubber dinghies and send them in to go ashore. And the PBY flies away, and they go in the Flying Tiger too, and they leave the coast of Cuba, and they go way out to a thing called Hognose Key, out in the ocean. They go around to the back side of it to stay out of view, and they're hanging out there. This is on the night of June 11th of 1963. And they're hanging out there behind. They're waiting for word from these guys that are attempting to kill Castro and these guys. And they're waiting for them. And on the night of June 11th, they're all getting shit-faced. They're sitting there drinking Jack Daniel's whiskey and sharing it back and forth. And they all start raging about John Kennedy and what an SOB this guy is. And this guy, Johnny Martino, is there. And William Rick Robertson is there. And William Pauley is there. And Rudy Enders is there, and they're all raging about this. And Johnny Martino is just insisting that there's something to be done about this. And William D. Pauley, the principal author of the Doolittle Report, turns to him and says, "Don't worry, Johnny, we're going to kill that motherfucker." You know, and this is the S-Force that we're looking at here. Pardon?
How's that documented?
That's documented because Dick Billings was standing right there and heard him say it. You know, he's like 2 feet away from him, sat right there and
Dick
listened.
Billings was on the Flying Tiger.
Dick Billings was on the Flying Tiger because he was sent there by Life magazine, because he was the Miami bureau chief of Life magazine, and William D. Pauley is a close friend of Henry Luce, who was the owner of Life magazine, and the C.D. Jackson, who's the publisher, is the father-in-law of Dick Billings.
But why would Life magazine have any? Why would they be involved with a covert operation on William Pauley's boat?
Because they wanted to have the photographs of the guys coming back having killed Fidel Castro. Because they're fascists, is a short answer to that. Henry Luce is a fascist, you know, and that he was supportive of all of this stuff. Henry Luce was part of that whole element that we're going to talk about when we get into what's really going on here. Well, who the hell are these guys anyway? You know, why is William Pauley, a private guy that happens to own all of the public transportation system in Cuba, both the trolley cars and the buses in the island of Cuba, and owns a whole bunch of the sugar plantations there? Why is this multi-billionaire? What's he doing with his private yacht? You know, bringing the S-Force in from a PBY, this delivered by the United States Navy, and when in fact the next morning when Dick Billings comes up from down below decks, when he sees a United States naval vessel sitting there refueling the boat, refueling the Flying Tiger, from Guantanamo. So that means that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that means that the Chief of Operations of the Navy, which is Arleigh Burke at that time, obviously they're involved in this. That they are in complete and open defiance of the President of the United States that's ordered them to stand down from any further efforts to assassinate Castro and these people. So they're in continuing defiance of the President of the United States. And what happens is they end up getting killed, probably, those guys. They never come back. And so they end up coming back and continuing, but they continue the operations to try to kill Castro. And so what they're doing is they're totally undermining the authority of the president. The president has got commitments going with Khrushchev. He's involved in trying to negotiate a treaty pursuant to which the United States and the Soviet Union are going to first start agreeing to refuse to have any more atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons. And he's working in 18 private letters of exchange between Khrushchev and Kennedy, trying to work toward disassembling all the nuclear missiles. Basically, disassembling the nuclear missiles that the United States element has worked itself up into possessing so that they can assert absolute supremacy militarily in the world. And if you can get the Soviet Union to disassemble theirs as well, Kennedy believes that this is a strategic advantage that's going to be had for the whole world. But the guys who are in charge of the nuclear missiles, who are in charge of the United States military, who are in charge of and have been charged by both political parties, Republican and Democrat, for having to build the strongest, powerful military in the world to be able to promote and protect the interests of the United States. So here are these guys who are viewing, just think how they're thinking now. They're looking at John Kennedy, a cream puff little fop who's basically, his father has bought him the presidency, who is in fact stooping every one of the interns he can get near, in the White House swimming pool, and offering them up to his bodyguards, and they're saying to themselves, this little creep, is basically getting set to disassemble the entire nuclear warhead system of the United States. So what they're starting to say to themselves, all of these guys, the CIA, is that they're, at a minimum, they're going to say, we're going to continue the operations that we believe need to be done to protect the interests of the United States and to project U.S. military power into the world to protect our interests at home and abroad, no matter what this guy says. But the problem was that Kennedy, basically, just like they had taken the bit in their teeth, and that they were going to continue these operations to try to assassinate Castro. They were going to continue their operations. That what happened is Kennedy took the bit in his teeth, and he decided that he was going to go completely around them, outside of all channels, and was going to conduct completely private communications through non-governmental sources, both with Castro and with Khrushchev. So these guys actually began to use the term traitor. The CIA heads and the military Joint Chiefs of Staff were discussing John Kennedy as a traitor against the United States. That he had gone completely out from under the control of the bureaucratic institutions. He was going out around them and having private letter communications, 18 of them, with Khrushchev, looking toward disassembling the nuclear weapons capacity of the United States. And of course, they had been trained not to trust the Soviets. And so they didn't believe that the Soviets were really going to be able to, were going to disassemble their missiles. And we were going to be caught completely helpless by this. And this was the point at which John Kennedy asked Fletcher Nebel, who had reported to them, to the president, that Curtis LeMay called him a spineless little coward and a sniveling little brat, and that he asked him to write the book, 7 Days in May. And he then approached John Frankenheimer in Hollywood and asked him to do it as a movie. And that's why I've suggested to you that you see that movie, 7 Days in May, starring Kirk Douglas and what's his name, that plays James Mattoon Scott, Burt Lancaster, you know, and it's a full-scale motion picture portraying the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the modern times, defying the President of the United States, who is trying to negotiate a nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union, looking toward disassembling the nuclear arsenals of both governments. And that they have actually mounted a full-scale plan to cause a military coup d'etat against the President of the United States. And interestingly, in the final scene of the movie, you know, I won't tell you the end of it, but let us say that the people in the movie were less successful than the real guys. Okay? Because what we have here now is the Central Intelligence Agency that is in open defiance of the President, with support of the Joint Military Command that were providing military and paramilitary support to them for carrying on their activities. The President defying them defying the President. And this situation obtains, and what President Kennedy does is President Kennedy fires Allen Dulles, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he fires Charles Cabell, the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he fires Bill Harvey, and he fires Richard Bissell, and he starts firing these guys, and he replaces as the Joint Chiefs. He puts in Taylor and removes Lemitzer as the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So what you see happening here is that, and this is unbeknownst to most people, and still to this day, that there's this huge civil war going on inside the United States government, where Kennedy is attempting to establish a completely new relationship with the Soviet Union, a completely new relationship with Cuba, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Central Intelligence Agency are defying him using all of the tools that they've developed over the entire duration of the Cold War against the President of the United States. So the question that remains is, will the Central Intelligence Agency resort to the use of its ultimate weapon, which is assassination? And what we know is that we know that certain things happen. We know that when you look at the history of Lee Harvey Oswald, we know perfectly well that very peculiar things were going on with Lee Harvey Oswald. That when Lee Harvey Oswald was based at a secret U-2 base in Japan, that he was having communications and contact with Japanese nationals who were attempting to solicit information about what was going on with the U-2s as a matter of espionage. And he had communications with them, and we know that he continued those communications, and suddenly he starts being trained in the Russian language, and he decides he's going to withdraw from the United States military. He just files an application to withdraw from the United States Marine Corps. Like, oh, I don't like it here anymore. I think I'd like to leave. My mom needs me at home. And they say, gee, okay, that's okay with us. And so he then leaves the United States Marine Corps, and within a matter of 3 or 4 days, he decides he's going to go to the Soviet Union. And he applies for a passport to get to go to the Soviet Union. And they say, "Greer, that's okay. It's just you just came from a U-2 facility, which is a top secret military facility, and you decide you want to go to the Soviet Union. Sure, I hope you have a good time." And he ends up getting a $1,500 ticket bought. He only had $211 in his bank account. Okay, and so he shows up over in the Soviet Union, and he's there, and he ends up marrying, within the first year he's there, he ends up marrying a woman whose uncle is a KGB military commander. Okay, and that he's working at the place in Minsk, and he's there for 2 or 3 months at that spot. And what we discover is that there is a special training operation going on through the United States Navy, which is in charge of the Marine Corps. And the Office of Naval Intelligence has a special training base in North Carolina where they're training It's called Operation Redskin is the name of it. And they're training United States military guys to actually go into the Soviet Union under the guise of defecting and trying to get infiltrated into the Soviet Union to spy. Okay? And so we know that that's going on at the exact same time. And Lee Harvey Oswald, is there in Russia, and he decides after a year and a half of being there or so that he's not succeeding, and so he says to the Soviets, "I think I want to leave." And they say, "Okay, you can leave." And so he applies to the United States and says, "I'd like to come back." And they say, "Okay, come on back." And he says, "Okay, I'd like to get a visa and a passport." And they say, "Sure, come on." And so he comes back and he lands, and he's met at the boat. He's met actually by a major East Russian, White Russian Tsarist group that take him into their friendship. All of a sudden, he's the golden boy of this group of people that are right-wing fascist, pro-fascist, anti-Bolshevik organizers who happen to be working as allies with the United States when the United States mounted a foreign military expeditionary force in 1917 to try to overthrow the Bolshevik government. Okay? So this is the guy who's supposed to be the leftist, right? This is the leftist Lee Harvey Oswald, who's met at the boat by a whole group of fascists who bring him into their bosom and start helping him and getting him jobs. Right? This is for New Orleans and in Dallas, both. He's got elements of that same group there.
Danny, I just wanted to say that the first guy that met him off, it was a gentleman by the name of Max Clark, who happened to be at the time the head of security for the Convair Division of General Dynamics, which he was part of Traveler's Aid.
That's right. He's a member of Traveler's Aid.
Weird.
And he was the Secretary General of a group that was made up of Tsarist Russians that were here in the United States. So that this guy is not a normal dude, And so what we see happening here is him now in New Orleans, and he's immediately palled up with Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister is the former head of the 5 Squad, Division 5 of the FBI in Chicago, who are in charge of anti-espionage activities. And he is retired now. He's in New Orleans, and he is the president of the Caribbean chapter of the World Anti-Communist League. Right? And so it turns out that Lee Harvey Oswald happens to have his office in the same office with this guy. Okay? It's at 544 Camp Street. And Guy Bannister's office is on the other side of the building. It's a different door going into the exact same office. And Lee Harvey Oswald is there with him, the head of the World Anti-Communist League's division of the Caribbean, and he's hanging out with David Ferry and these other guys who are all in the process of raiding a United States military armory, which they just happen to walk into because they've got the key, as it turns out. They open up the armory, they take all the military equipment out of there, and they deliver it to Lake Pontchartrain, to one of the 5 paramilitary bases on the northern shore of Lake Pontchartrain. Does that mean I'm past the time? I can see.
That's the World Anti-Fascist League who raided the
the anti-communist league. That's right.
But he was a communist.
No. So here's what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is that there is major evidence indicating that Lee Harvey Oswald was in fact a trained intelligence, a low-level intelligence operative working for the United States military intelligence, specifically the Office of Naval Intelligence, trained as an agent of Operation Redskin inside the Soviet Union, and he came back and that he was actually working in the operations with Guy Bannister in New Orleans, and that he was working very closely with George de Mohrenschildt in Dallas. And Ruth Payne, the woman who got him the job at the Texas Book Depository, was also part of that same exact group. So what I'm suggesting here is that whatever activity Lee Harvey Oswald was engaged in he was not likely engaged in that activity as a simple civilian. And the fact is that we know that there were at least 5 different occasions on which a person saying that they were Lee Harvey Oswald engaged in activity that ended up being attributed to Lee Harvey Oswald. For example, going to the firing ranges around Dallas and firing a Mannlicher Carcano at the firing ranges and making a complete spectacle of himself. For example, of firing at other people's targets and going, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald, I'm firing at your target, just so that you'll know who I am. And that he went to the store and there were people sending in to buy a Mannlicher Carcano rifle, in the name of A. Heidel, which was things that he had signed as an AKA that he used. So it was perfectly clear, and I'll say it in conclusion on this point, is that Lee Harvey Oswald was being set up by the Central Intelligence Agency's S-Force to be charged with responsibility for having been the person who assassinated Fidel Castro. And that when, in fact, the decision was made to do the 180-degree turn to kill the President of the United States because he was a traitor, because he was a spineless fool who was basically giving away the nuclear arsenal of the United States and attempting to allow a communist regime to exist within 90 miles of our shores, that a decision was made to kill him, and that it was done by the Central Intelligence Agency. And it was known about and it was signed off on by people at the highest levels of the Central Intelligence Agency that would have included Alan Dulles, that would have included David Atlee Phillips, that would have included Bill Harvey, it would have included, of course, David Sanchez Morales, Theodore Shackley, and James Jesus Angleton. Okay? And so that the fact of the matter is, if I were charged with prosecuting the Central Intelligence Agency as an organization for having killed the president, I can guarantee you that I would convict them. Okay? And they're probably not the ones that made the initial decision to do it. So that's for another class. Okay? So that's the story of the CIA. So listen, your papers are due on Tuesday, you guys. The next essay. Actually, on December 3rd, we're going back to
History goes on. We're in a hurry. I'm gonna